this position, Mr. Speaker, has not changed. As I said, Mr. Speaker, Canada was not consulted, did not participate, and has no plans to participate in the offensive actions that were taken by the U.S.
And now he has gone into hiding, having failed to speak a single word in tonight's debate. In this time of crisis, Canadians deserve to know where the Prime Minister stands. Indeed, they deserve to know where the Prime Minister is.
I don't believe that the lack of clarity and coherence in the last 10 days have contributed for Canada or Mr. Carney to pretend to any kind of leadership.
MPs from all political stripes gathered in the House of Commons last night, drilling down on what exactly the federal government's position is on the conflict in Iran. The opposition demanded clarity from Prime Minister Mark Carney, accusing him of, quote, flip-flopping over shifting statements he's made about the war over the last 11 days. The Prime Minister initially voiced support for the U.S.-Israel strikes on Iran, but days later said it likely violated international law. Mark Carney took flack from the opposition for being absent as well at last night's debate, which he missed due to a previous commitment. His itinerary for today initially did not list question period, but was later amended to include it. Let's bring in our front bench to talk about all of that. Former senior advisor to the Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, Dan Moulton is here. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Larissa Waller is the founder of Henley Strategies and a former head of communications for Ontario's Conservative Premier Doug Ford. George Soule was director of communications for the federal NDP, now a principal at OnStep Strategies. And Laura Stone is a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Good to see you tonight. I appreciate you making the time. Dan, I'll start with you. What do you think of the way in which the Prime Minister's policy has been criticized by the opposition? Sort of, it's been a focal point for them, kind of culminating in this debate, which I should say was convened by the government last night, and then the Prime Minister wasn't there. What do you make of that?
Well, look, I think it's not surprising the opposition are trying to make hay here. They are seeing an opportunity to poke holes in the government's position, and that's their job. That's what the opposition are meant to do. It's part of a healthy democracy. So, you know, of course we expect the opposition to be behaving this way. I do think the government makes a point, though. It's public statements on this topic have, I think, evolved as the situation's evolved, right? It was very clear the Prime Minister made a quick response to the action by President Trump in a real politics sort of way. He was out there trying to articulate Canada's position, which has long been that there should be regime change in Iran and that they are the world's largest sponsor of state terrorism, that there are positive objectives at play here. And, you know, he was quick to say that. As the situation's evolved, I think his public statements have with it. There's a fine line to walk here, and I think he's been doing that quite skillfully. I do think it is typical. I think as Canadians, we tend in our public conversation on these topics to cast ourselves and our government's policy as the main character in this story. I don't think that's the case. And so I think we should be realistic about what our diplomacy should be seeking to achieve in this circumstance. I think the Prime Minister has said, look, we see you know, benefits in this, but there are obviously also risks. And I think he's talking about that in the context as much as anything in the domestic political environment, in which there are different constituencies within this country that are very strongly in support of regime change in that country. And there are other Canadian populations, many of them who would be supporters of the government, that are going to be wary of any international adventurism on the part of the Americans, particularly the current president. And so I think he's trying to walk a careful balance here. And yes, of course, the opposition are going to try and poke holes in it wherever they can.
I do think there is a real tension between, you know, not the politics, but as Dan put it, Larissa, the fact that the Iranian regime is as terrible as it is, right? Objectively so, and that so many people in this country outside of it, and in Iran especially, want to see regime change. But the tension exists with the fact that it is Donald Trump leading this military operation right now, and there's not only a lack of clarity there, but also like a certain sentiment towards Trump here in Canada more largely. How do you see that tension playing out in the domestic political arena right now?
I think it's a lot of people who, like you said, would normally celebrate a regime change and celebrate this action taken against the Iranian regime. They really, really don't like Donald Trump. So how could somebody they hate so much do something that I don't really disagree with? And I think that maybe there are a lot of liberals sort of trying to figure that moral predicament out. I think the Conservatives have been, unwavering in their position on the Iranian regime. It has been a long time, almost a pillar in Conservative foreign policy that they want to see a regime change, and they want to see the federal Liberal government crack down on the Iranian regime and their operations and their presence in Canada. And we saw some movement. We haven't seen enough movement from my perspective. But I think on this one, you saw Mark Carney originally come out with a statement that I supported, that I think a lot of people were quite surprised was unambiguously supporting the U.S. action. Then you saw Minister Anand say something different. Then you saw Minister McGuinty say something different. And then the Prime Minister say something different. So I think Canadians are rightly fair to criticize sort of this shifting perspective. This is a values question. I don't really care who did it. I don't really care if you like the guy who did it. But getting rid of these murderous dictators in Iran who murder their own people, throw gay people off buildings, attack women and kill women for the crime of showing their hair. Getting rid of those bad guys, that has to be a good thing. That has to be supported, regardless if you don't like the guy who did it.
Do you think that, George, the positioning from the government and the sort of difference between the initial statement and what it eventually evolved to become can be explained by the inconsistency around Donald Trump and the Trump factor more largely? Or is it that in combination with, for example, somebody like Will Greaves or Lloyd Axworthy or other Liberals who were pushing back against the Prime Minister's initial stance?
It's probably more the latter than the former, probably. I mean, and I think part of the problem here is you can't actually treat like the initial attack and the war as two separate things, because, I mean, like what happened is Mark Carney came out and celebrated the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump lit a fuse, and then later came out and was somehow upset about the fact that it exploded. These things are connected. The war is the inevitable next step of taking out the Ayatollah. There's no doubt. I want to be very clear that Democrats, myself, everybody agrees the Ayatollah was a terrible leader, did terrible, horrific things to all kinds of his people, and should have been removed. The reason he wasn't removed beforehand, or this kind of thing hasn't happened before, is because this kind of war is the inevitable next step. So I feel like the Prime Minister came out with the knee-jerk reaction of this is great that they've taken this guy out, that's awesome, but didn't think forward to the next steps. And so that's what we're now seeing happen is, and maybe, right, some of the folks from that understand politics and understand the global affairs away from the kind of banking side, maybe better than Mark Carney does, have come forward and talked to him about it. Maybe that's why we're seeing the shift. But let's be clear, it is not two separate things. It is all one big action and the consequences that were inevitable.
The Liberals argue, Laura, that there isn't a difference in the position, that it's just simply, evolved to reflect the different realities. Obviously, as we've heard tonight, opposition says, no, these are different things that you've said at different times that don't all add up. How would you split the difference, if at all?
Well, look, I mean, I think there's been kind of a dearth of explanation, and from that comes criticism. I mean, I think most people would have expected the Prime Minister to attend that debate tonight, and understanding that he had other commitments, he had places to be. But as you noted, this was his government that organized it. He could have shown up for maybe 20 minutes and given a statement and answered some questions. I know he did that in the House today when that was added to his schedule, but it's an important debate to have, and there's been some nuance added to the government's position. There's been maybe some time to think about things. There's been an evolving situation to react to. I think everyone kind of understands this is happening in real time, but I think the problem is that there hasn't been a sufficient explanation from the person at the top, the Prime Minister, to speak directly to Canadians. And I think that's where the problem has come in. Today, the debate in the House of Commons seemed to shift more towards the domestic circumstances and fallout from this, and that could be the next step in this debate. But I think communication is key here, and I think there's now kind of this perception a little bit with all of the Prime Minister's travel, and then there's an understanding, I think, on the part of the Canadian public why this is happening. But he still has to remember to speak to the Canadian people, and that might be one of the lessons that came out of this incident with Iran and the shifting positions, or the added complexity to Canada's position and the explanation and the description that was added to it, and that might be perfectly fine and understandable, but I think there needs to be more of that on the part of the government.